Welcome back. Today we're going to discuss the 12-year period before the Civil War broke out in 1860. The title of this chapter is The Gathering Storm, which, not by coincidence, is also the chapter of Winston Churchill's famous book on Europe before World War II. So the Gathering Storm, people realized that the North and South were entering into greater and greater problems, and near the end of the 1850s, it looked like war was inevitable. Looking briefly at the context, you recall the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which protected slavery in those southern states where it existed, but forbid it in new territories. And of course, as part of this compromise, the territory of Maine became a state, the territory of Missouri became a slave state, and the state of Maine was created out of the territory of Massachusetts and became a free state. The real question now, after the war with Mexico ended in 1848, was how to deal with slavery in the new territory that had been acquired from Mexico. The key was balance in Congress, and some southern states even threatened to leave the country or secession if they were not allowed to expand their, quote, peculiar institution or slavery. In 1848, gold was discovered in Northern California. In early 1849, word reached the rest of the country, and so there was the famous California Gold Rush. So now we have the situation where California has tens of thousands of residents, and it applied to be a state. The question will be, will it be a free state or a slave state? This is a political cartoon from the time showing the importance of having a balance in Congress. The Compromise of 1850, and we're 30 years after the Compromise of 1820, of California was admitted as a free state, and the other territory acquired from Mexico in the recent war was divided up into the Utah and New Mexico territories, where the issue of whether they would be slave or free states would be left open to popular sovereignty. In other words, the inhabitants of those territories would, at some future point, decide when they sought statehood whether they wanted to be free or slave. Another element of the Compromise of 1850, and this was done to balance the deal in favor, to give something to the Southerners, because admitting California as a free state was a victory for the Northern abolitionists and anti-slave population, was the passage of a very strong fugitive slave law. This is a federal law that required both the federal government and the northern states and their inhabitants to capture and return runaway slaves. So if a slave hunter from the South went up to a little village in Vermont and said, I've heard that, Joe, one of our slaves, has run away. You must help us. And this absolutely infuriated Northerners, because they generally didn't like slavery, but they thought, well, it's a long way away. Now they are directly involved by federal law in implementing the system of slavery. Here we have a map which shows California now as a free state. The areas in the purplish color are all free states or territories. And you see to the north of California, Oregon Territory. It's not yet a state. To the east, the so-called unorganized territory, Minnesota Territory, and then moving east in the north, they're all states. moving east from California, you have the Utah and New Mexico territories, which are much larger than the current states of Utah and New Mexico. And again, these territories, the inhabitants of those territories, under the terms of the Compromise of 1850, would vote themselves whether they would be a free or slave state when they entered the United States. And then, of course, moving east, you have Texas, which by 1850 was a state, as we saw earlier. And you have what's the current state of Oklahoma, which was then called Indian Territory, which had slavery. Although it was not a state, it was just Indian Territory. And then you can see the rest of the South. What's interesting to notice are the numbers underneath the states. Those are the number of representatives in the House of Representatives in Washington. And you'll see at this time in 1850, Texas only had 2 representatives. Of course, now it has over 30. And you can see California, which also had a small population at this time, only had 2 representatives. And of course, California has over 50 representatives. But again, under the terms of the Constitution, as you recall, all of the states have the same number of senators, 2. So while the North may have more representatives in the House of Representatives, the South was very keen and eager that it maintain a balance in the Senate. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was by far the most widely read book of the century. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a Northerner. Her father was a very well-known minister, spoke out against slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe was outraged by the passage of the Compromise of 1850, the provision of the Fugitive Slave Law. She had never been to the South, but she had witnessed a slave auction and become very, very hostile to slavery. And so she thought that a novel in which people could relate to the characters would be perhaps an effective means of increasing anti-slavery sentiment. And this was a phenomenal success. Most students used to read Uncle Tom's Cabin in junior high school or high school, but last few years, students tell me they haven't read it previously. That's okay. What I suggest you do is, to really understand this, be sure to watch the videos in this module on Uncle Tom's Cabin. It will explain the basic outline of the plot, and it will explain why the novel had such a phenomenal impact. On this slide, we see a famous scene in which the slave owner, Philip Legree, is whipping the kind, elderly Uncle Tom. Here we see an advertisement for the book, which, as I mentioned before, was the most widely sold book in the United States in the 1800s. And it was widely read also in Europe, and it has been translated into over 70 languages now. It is reported that when Abraham Lincoln, a few years after the Civil War started, met Harriet Beecher Stowe at a reception at the White House, and he turned to her and said, "Oh, so you're the little woman who started this war." So be sure and watch the videos, and they will explain in great detail the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what's also interesting is the South categorically rejected the portrayal of slavery in Uncle Tom's Cabin. They said it was biased. Harriet Beecher Stowe had never even been to the South. She didn't know what was happening with slavery. And so there were a number of called AntiTom novels that came out, books written by Southerners, novels to portray slavery in a much more favorable light. One of them is famous one is Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, and it's about the life of a family and how the slaves are generally treated well. And it's a reaction to Uncle Tom's Cabin, because the author will say, well, unlike Harriet Beecher Stowe, who doesn't know slavery, we in the South do, and we know that the slaves are treated well, with possible exception here or there of a harsh master. Shortly after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, you had the passage by Congress in 1854 of the KansasNebraska Act. Now, this act greatly inflamed sentiments both in the North and the South, and seen in retrospect was clearly another divisive factor leading to an increase in sectionalism. What the KansasNebraska Act called for was popular sovereignty for the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and they could determine whether they wanted slavery or not. The argument was, well, the large territories of Utah and New Mexico were given the right for popular sovereignty under the terms of the Compromise of 1850. The same should be done for the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase. Of course, this is just the opposite of what the Missouri Compromise of 1820 stipulated. And you'll recall that the Missouri Compromise said there would be no slavery north of the southern border of Missouri. Now Congress has changed that. This act so infuriated many northern anti-slavery voters that they formed the Republican Party. This is the Republican Party that we'll see in a few years elected Abraham Lincoln as president. And this is the same Republican Party that we have in the United States today. Previously in the course, we've seen other political parties, none of which have continued. So now we do see the Republican Party formed after the passage of the KansasNebraska Act. So what happened was both sides, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery, sent settlers to Kansas. The idea people would move there, set up a farm, and the territory had enough people, which would happen fairly soon. There would be a vote to apply to Congress for statehood, and both sides wanted to have more of their inhabitants in the state so they could either vote for or against slavery. Now you notice on the map that on the next page, on the next slide, that Missouri is right next to Kansas. Missouri, of course, came in as a slave state in the 1820 Compromise. So many slaveholders from Missouri moved or sent their children to live in Kansas. Well, the result was tensions were very high, and not just tensions, but there was actual shooting, and it was known as Bleeding Kansas, and there were approximately 200 deaths between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. This slide is talking about, you can see Kansas territory. It's larger than the current state of Kansas, and how Missouri is right next to it. And so it was easy for people from Missouri to move into Kansas. Also, Kansas, good agricultural soil, and the thought for Southerners was it would be a perfect location to expand slavery. This is a drawing from the time entitled Bleeding Kansas, and here you can see some of the violence that I mentioned earlier. This violence between North and South even spilled over onto the floor of the U.S. Congress, and you see a representative from Massachusetts was thrown down by a representative in the South who claimed that the anti-slavery speech by the Massachusetts representative had insulted the South. Another major factor that drove the North and South apart was the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1857 regarding Dred Scott, who had sued in federal courts a number of years earlier for his freedom. He had been acquired or bought as a slave by a U.S. Army doctor. He had been bought in a slave state, had lived in a slave state, but then the U.S. Army doctor was transferred to a military base in Minnesota, and Minnesota did not have slavery. It was not a state yet; it was still a territory, and so Dred Scott argued that he was free because he had moved to a territory that banned slavery, and this, of course, was both under the terms of the 1820 Missouri Compromise and the Northwest Ordinance. Well, in a major decision by the Supreme Court, of whom 5 of the 9 justices were slaveholders themselves, the court ruled that slaves were not people but property, and therefore Dred Scott remained the property of his owner. And the court went much further, which was not necessary in deciding this case, and said Dred Scott did not even have the right to enter a legal system because no black residing in the United States was a U.S. citizen, and it didn't matter whether the blacks were free or enslaved. They were not citizens of the United States. And so and they also said as part of this that Congress had no authority to limit slavery in a federal territory. So this declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional because the Missouri Compromise, as you recall, had allowed Missouri to enter the United States as a free state, but had outlawed or banned slavery in the other areas of the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern boundary of Missouri. Well, beyond the fate of the individual Dred Scott, the political result of this was phenomenal. What it meant was slavery's expansion could never be limited by Congress. This was the hope of anti-slavery Northerners. These anti-slavery Northerners were different than abolitionists. Abolitionists felt slavery was evil and should be eliminated everywhere as soon as possible, everywhere it existed. Anti-slavery Northerners also felt slavery was immoral. They did not condone slavery, but they claimed they were more realistic, that slavery was going to continue where it existed, and the focus should be on preventing the expansion of slavery elsewhere. But as a result of the Dred Scott decision, it was evident to all that there was no way Congress could limit the expansion of slavery because the Supreme Court had just ruled that it didn't have such power. The next event in the decade of the 1850s, and as you see, there are quite a number of events during this decade that are driving the North and South further and further apart. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln was a candidate to be senator from the state of Illinois, and he had many debates in public with Stephen Douglas. Of course, at that time, there was no television or radio to report such events, but the newspapers covered the debates in great detail, and thanks to these debates, Abraham Lincoln became widely known, and I note that he lost the election, so he did not become senator, and he'll become president in 2 more years, as we'll see in 1860. During these debates, Lincoln said slavery was evil, but he said it was unavoidable because he felt that blacks were racially inferior, and he strongly opposed, however, the extension of slavery to the new territories. So, as I mentioned just a moment ago, you can consider Abraham Lincoln as anti-slavery, but not an abolitionist. Now, the Southerners read about these debates, and they were outraged by Lincoln's claim that slavery was immoral. And so at this point, the South is outnumbered in Congress because Minnesota and Oregon enter as free states. And some Southerners began to talk openly of leaving the United States or secession. After Harpers Ferry in 1859, the wrong way. After Harpers Ferry in 1859, it's no exaggeration to say the nation was in a trauma. The South, at this point, the Southern whites saw their very survival in question, and several Southern states promised to secede if the Republicans won the 1860 election. Well, as we all know, in 1860, the Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln did win. Even though he only received 39% of the vote, he won because the Democrats had split into the Southern and Northern factions. And the key issue in this election had been slavery and sectionalism. Here we have the results of the election, and you can see Abraham Lincoln's states are in orange. He clearly won the North, and he won California and Oregon. But then you'll see the Democrats are divided. You know, we have the Northern Democrat, Stephen Douglas, won a few states, and the Southern Democrat. You also have another candidate, John Bell from Constitutional Union, who won some of the northern slave states. But the net result was Abraham Lincoln was elected. Well, now, for the first time in American history, you have a regional party holding the presidency, a purely regional party, the Republicans. After his election and before he was inaugurated, Lincoln promised that slavery could continue in the states where it existed, but opposed its expansion to any federal territory. Now, at this time, when the election was still held in early November, but the inauguration of a new president did not occur until March. Of course, now it occurs on January 20th. So there was a long so-called Lameduck period after the election in which the new president was president-elect, but not yet the president. Well, so outraged by Lincoln's election, even before his inauguration in March, South Carolina and a number of other Deep South Southern states seceded, and Texas was one of those, and said that they were leaving the United States. Those states formed the Confederate States of America. This was modeled on the Confederation of the United States when it first became independent from Britain. And the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy, guaranteed strong state rights as well as protection of slavery in territories that had not yet become states. Now, the Confederates claimed that they were the true Americans and they were returning to the principles of the American Revolution, and that the Republican Party had gone astray. Texas joined, as I mentioned a moment ago, despite the strong objections from Sam Houston, who resigned his office as soon as Texas joined the Confederacy. So we don't have shooting yet. We don't have a war in terms of bullets, but we have the entire Deep South having proclaimed that it is no longer part of the United States of America and it has become independent. Here we have from Charleston, South Carolina, just a bulletin that the Union was dissolved. Well, in March 1865, there was still not a shooting war, but during his inauguration, Lincoln said, if war did come, and he hoped very much it would not, it would be over the issue of succession, not slavery per se, as the federal government had the duty to maintain the Union by any means. Well, immediately after Lincoln's inauguration, the Confederates opened fire on a U.S. Army base, Fort Sumter, in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Now, President Lincoln did not want to take the first shots in the war, and the South had insisted that the United States Army and Navy remove all of its bases in the Confederate States of America. And Lincoln said no, he did not recognize the fact that they had left the United States. And so the Southerners attacked Fort Sumter, which had to surrender after fairly shortly because they could not be supplied and they ran out of ammunition. The North at this point strongly supported the war, and as we'll see in great detail in the next class, both sides thought initially that they could easily defeat the other side militarily and the war would only last a few months. It's significant to note, and we'll see this more in the next module, that not all the Upper South states with slaves joined the Confederacy. Now, the Deep South states had succeeded before Lincoln was inaugurated. After he was inaugurated and the shooting started, the Upper South states, such as Virginia, the most important Southern state, joined the Confederacy. But there were a number of Upper South states with slaves that never joined the Confederacy. And so these states were important, and as we'll see, particularly the state of Maryland, which is right next to Washington, D.C. And finally, this slide just shows a drawing from the time of the attack at Fort Sumter, just outside Charleston, South Carolina. If you go to Charleston, South Carolina, you can actually see many of these beautiful homes still there, and these are the wealthy Southerners standing on their rooftops, watching, cheering the fact that the Southerners were attacking the fort, and of course they were delighted when the fort surrendered. Thank you very much.